piece. This is a nice opportunity. This is the work. It's an encaustic monotype. And so I thought I'd start by explaining that encaustic is a kind of paint that's made with beeswax. And so it's all based on temperature. The paint is beeswax mixed with dry pigment and has to be heated until it's molten and it becomes paint. And a monotype is a print. It turns out that encaustic paint can also be used to make a print. As well as making paintings on panels with encaustic, in the past I also used to use encaustic on paper, combined with other materials like pastel or ink or various mixed media and collage. But one of the, even though encaustic is ancient and very permanent and has a lot of virtues, it can't handle flexing, particularly if it's not very warm. And so, although many of the works on paper that I did with encaustic paint on them have survived very well, they can be damaged if they're not framed and if they're moved around too much. The encaustic paint can crack off, or pieces of it can crack off. So when I realized that those works on paper were fragile, I really stopped painting with encaustic on paper. But 11 years ago, I went to the first National Encaustic Painting Conference in Massachusetts, and I saw a demonstration by an artist from Santa Fe, New Mexico, named Paula Rowland, who does encaustic printmaking. And she had a heat surface that was a double hot box. Each box had 4 100-watt light bulbs as the heat source and a sheet of anodized aluminum on top. And she demonstrated how she would make these one-of-a-kind prints that are very quick. You put the paint on the palette, which is also the printing surface, put paper down, rub the back a little bit, and boom, print. And I thought, this is a good idea, because unlike painting on paper with the encaustic paint, when you do a print, the paint really goes into the paper. So there's no potential for it to come off. It's not going to flake off because it's really in the paper. So I came back to Buffalo and built my own hot box and got a sheet of aluminum. And so I use that as a palette now, but I also use it to print, okay? And this particular one is one of the series that I'm, I guess, continuing with. I've done about 15 in this series, this size, based on trees, but also expressing my love of color and color relationships. There are also some interesting textures, other things going on with it. I went to the 10th Encaustic Conference a little over a year ago, and that's why I'm wearing my Encaustic Conference shirt, and I have my Encaustic Conference badge. And the reason that it's relevant to this work is that I saw a demonstration by an artist named David O. Black, who demonstrated a method of printing instead of just printing off the palette plate, that he would actually put the encaustic paint on a material called Duralar, which is a transparent film, kind of like acetate or mylar. But Duralar has the virtue of being resistant to heat, so it doesn't change shape when it gets hot. So it's really ideal for printing on. And so I was fortunate to be on sabbatical this spring, and I did an artist residency at the Vermont Studio School. And I used that as an opportunity to explore more ways of using Duralar to assist in creating a print. And one of the first visiting artists that came to help our practice, all these artists that were there, was like some of the paintings that I was doing, that instead of being really pretty non-objective, still had some discernible tree imagery. And so I thought, well, that sort of validates what I'm thinking anyway, so I will continue to, so I'll incorporate the tree image in the monotype prints, which I hadn't been doing previously. And so I went back to an earlier approach to doing the print, which involves making a transfer. So the way this happened is I put a layer of wax on the hot box, and this is actually a photograph I took of the hot box with the transfer drawing on the wax layer, okay? So I just happened, I didn't realize until I came to the opening that I had this picture of the process. So I did the charcoal drawing of the tree and then put it face down on the wax at room temperature and rubbed the back really, really, really hard. Lifted off the paper, and so the charcoal drawing is transferred perfectly into the wax surface. Then I heat it up, and then I do an initial print. So that's the first run. In the meantime, I also met a sculptor from Massachusetts, and he came by the studio and he said, you know, one of the issues that I have with a lot of printmaking is there doesn't seem to be enough contrast, value contrast. And sure enough, the initial print of the tree image was kind of pale and ghost-like because the charcoal is, you know, diffused in the wax layer. So I used Duralar to make an initial darker version of the trunk. So I laid a piece of Duralar right over the initial print and then just made little outlines of where the branches and trunks were that needed to be darker with Sharpie. Works great, okay? So then I laid the Duralar on the hot plate and then painted those areas with this kind of dark blue paint and printed it again to make the branches darker. In the meantime, I also added some other color areas. And so that's how it came about. It seemed a little involved because there were multiple runs, okay? Because I actually had to outline the negative shapes to fill them in with color. And so this other fellow artist at this residency, I'm describing this process, and she says, wow, that sounds like a lot of effort to go through to just make a print, you know? Like, you know, why are you doing this? Well, again, because I enjoy the interactions that are happening in the work, and it's also because it's a monoprint, I don't have to worry about it being fragile. So I've been continuing to explore that approach, at least for the time being. There are other ways that it could go. But I still am fascinated with sort of interaction of negative spaces and color that we see in these kind of works. I don't know, is that 10 minutes?
And if you look, so there's some trees and they're colorful, and if you look closely, she's saying, you're hurtling towards certain depth. Doesn't this all seem a little trite? So, how did this piece come about? I brought my sketchbook so I can show you some initial beginnings of this, if I can find the right page. So this is kind of the first thing I made that was like this. And it started just as a bunch of globs of watercolor and playing with just like layering them slightly to see how the colors interact. And then I added the textures, and then they looked like trees, so they became trees. And for whatever reason, that kind of bummed me out. I don't know why. Like, you're drawing something you don't know what it's going to be, and then it was trees, which is a perfectly acceptable thing to draw, you know? And to most sane people, it wouldn't like bother them that they drew trees. But I had to write trees just aren't enough for me. This person, like, obviously they are to some degree because I drew them, but on this other level they aren't. So I had to put this critic saying that in there. And at the time the phrase just popped into my head, and then later I realized that it's actually like on the first page of this book. Like, you know, the first page of the sketchbook's like super stressful, like what are you gonna draw to make it worthwhile, because it has to like reflect everything else that's to come, and then it just ends up being a tree. You know what I mean? Like, it's kind of upsetting on some level. So that's what that's about. But then I guess as I kept going with it and trying to kind of analyze why my inner critic has this prejudice against trees, and maybe to try to confront and overcome this by drawing a lot of them and playing with like how the colors layer and interact. It became kind of a conversation about the inner critic and the artistic process and how you critique your own work, I guess. But then on another level, I was also really interested with this idea of a human talking about nature as one would talk about art, you know? So like to bring in, like you would never go outside and see a bunch of daffodils on the ground and be like, ugh, I mean, I guess it's all right, but like if maybe there was more yellow over there, like then I could really get behind these daffodils. But somehow like that's what we do all the time with art. And you can kind of look at nature with this sort of naive sense of wonder, but when you're in the gallery, you have to think about all these other things that you were educated to think about. And these other constructed sort of human dialogues that we engage with. So to some degree, it's this sort of idea of beauty in nature versus beauty in art. And then on another level, I guess it's, so she's like in period garb and she's a figure that's obviously dead now, you know, she wouldn't, and part of that is because I have like all these old frames, like this frame had pictures of people that are clearly dead now, they're like old portraits. But I think it's sort of like this generational thing where someone from the past is critiquing me, somebody who's in the present. So then it's like, what are you doing with your life? Kind of conversation between me and a ghost. So I think on that level, it's kind of interesting, just like, what are you doing with your life? Is this meaningful? Like, why do you keep doing this? Which on a larger sense, I guess like looking back now, having been making different work for a month or so, I actually have changed a little bit what I'm making, started making things that have more to do with, like I make history comics, I make art about history typically, and I'm starting to do things that are also maybe projecting into the future, talking about global warming a little bit, talking about the fact that humanity as a whole, beyond just individuals dying, is likely to become extinct eventually and not in that distant of the future. So I think to some degree it's asking me to place my work on that scale. And what's the point of making work if it's just going to completely be destroyed and no one's going to see it in the future, right? So there's another level of what this is about. Yeah, so I guess I really appreciated winning the Best Gripping Existential Crisis because like that's what motivates my work constantly is just this question of why am I existing and what this thing is supposed to be and mean. And every time anything interesting changes in what I'm doing, it's because I'm having one of those sort of existential crises. I have to keep having them all the time, so I will hang this in my studio as a badge of honor. Thank you.
So, for the folks that are here that might not be familiar with my work, this rhinoceros character has been a part of my work on and off since 1998. He's loosely based on the play Rhinoceros by Eugene Ionesco, French absurdist playwright. The play was written in 1959. And I read that play in college. And it resonated with me when I was at UB in the illustration department that no longer exists. But it really stuck with me, the characters in the play. And to my knowledge, they've never really been illustrated or expanded on. So sort of like took that concept from the play and I put it in my own work. So really, what is a rhinoceros? What is that character? In part, what is the play about? So Ionesco uses a very like social commentary, scathing about power, the abuse of power. A rhinoceros runs through a French town, and one by one, the people that live in that town physically transform and turn into a rhinoceros. As time passes and people in power law enforcement, government officials, they all physically grow a horn and turn into this animal that to some is known as a violent or mindless kind of creature. I mean, a real life rhinoceros is known to charge violently at sounds or movements, mostly because of its poor eyesight. It doesn't really know what it's lunging out after. I take that part of the character, and for me, it's in the contemporary context of, I mean, this is, I don't know, to me, somewhat or very clearly that it's the Oval Office or it's, you know, things happening in our country or in the world today. And now that character does have, it is a poor eyesight thing, it's a blinded thing. They're blinded to the truth about themselves. And the reason people turn and why it's easy to turn in the play is that it's just easier to take what you want, do what you want at the expense of others, not care about other people, and only look out for yourself. So that was kind of the play at the time for me. A few years later, I did experience this physical attack that was like an awakening for me. And maybe where I was in my life, I don't know, maybe it was a good thing. I don't know if it was a good thing or a bad thing. I don't think good and bad. It wasn't that cut and dry, you know? It was like this real masculine, physical kind of thing that did open my eyes to the world around me a little bit. I mean, not that I don't think I lived a completely, what's that called? Just like an ultra safe, closed in, you know, life childhood, but, you know, my parents are still around and I'm lucky to have a good family. And so, yeah, I mean, I probably was sheltered a bit. And that opened up my eyes, you know, and now in my work, so over the years, it's been, you know, it's the look has changed, or maybe thematically things have changed, but it usually comes back to social issues, things happening in my life, things happening in the world, the loss of innocence. You know, this rhinoceros character has become a fake toy line and social clip action figures that are selling pipe bombs, girls' gas masks, and grenades and Molotov cocktails to kids because. You know, that company at least feels like children need to protect themselves. I know it sounds kind of ridiculous to say, but that's the way my brain works. I'm a father, I'm a teacher. I watch the world like my kids grow up in and my students grow up in. And again, going back to that loss of innocence. So it's scary, it's upsetting. For me, that's kind of what the character has now come to represent. You know, like that's just how it is. Yeah. It's an ink wash. let's put out the obvious now. I like working in that material. I don't know. I enjoy it. It had been a few years since I had made any specific rhinoceros pieces, and it did feel good to come back to it. You know, I've tried to, in my practice, experiment with different materials, and I mean, for example, right now I'm making life-size plaster sculptures, female forms and figures that are flying or floating or diving. They're wearing plaster gas masks. I just built a 10-foot tall plaster guillotine with plaster video cameras trained on a guillotine and a ticket taking machine next to it. And that's not necessarily, it's not overtly rhinoceros, but I think it still all comes back and ties together with that theme, just the stuff that I've done in my work for a while now. Favorite topical piece, and probably more importantly than that, favorite glass of water. I told my wife about that. She's like, Rich, I'm not gonna lie. I've always loved my drum glasses of water. Thank you, Kelly. I love you too. You know, I don't even want to say, just to get like, I don't want to say his name, you know who that is, right? And it grosses me out even saying his name. And that's why like the guillotine and why just these like destructive objects and things that are, I am sort of drawn to violent things, and you know, it's not like an obsession with death, but it's when I make this kind of stuff, I think it's always a self-reflection. I don't know about you guys, it's because I do have some of that character in me, you know, and I think a lot of people do, and you choose whether or not it comes out of you. You know, if you're going to be a good person or do the right thing, or, you know, fuck it, I'm just gonna like do whatever I want. It's way easier to do that, man. Or maybe that might say something about me, like it's harder to do what is supposed to be right, or, you know, like it takes effort. So maybe that's me sometimes like combating that, and I think when I put it into work, I don't know, I feel better when I make it. That's all I can say. I feel better when I make it. I think that's what it comes down to. Yep.
Prizes. I painted it from a photograph made in 1941 that I found in my parents' stuff. I have about 2 dozen of these tiny little photographs from a picnic that they had at a textile mill where they worked. There's my mom, and there's my dad, and he was an office manager and she was his secretary. You've heard about textile mills. They had them all over the country. They would come into a town and they would take over the town. And I'm interested in that kind of structure and how it reflected sexism and racism, especially with textile mills, because they hired initially only women and children because they would be cheaper. That's what they say textile mills do in China now. They just hire women because they're cheaper. But at this time, in 1941, the textile mill was very paternal. It tried to provide for its workers. There was a mill village of houses that the workers rented from the mill. There was a mill church. There were mill stores. They called them company shops. You've seen them revived in towns all over the place. So the textile mill became the culture for people, and they also provided entertainment, and often the people were the entertainment. The people entertained themselves. One thing that interested me in these pictures were there was a beauty pageant of Miss Mayfair, because it was Mayfair Mills, and so these girls in their swimsuits with numbers on their swimsuits, and these are swimsuits, by the way. They look like dresses people wear now, but they were in a beauty pageant, and it interests me how the photographer took a lot of pictures like these that are kind of downtime. They aren't people posing exactly. They're people kind of sitting and waiting for the next thing. So I have, like I said, 2 dozen of these. There's also a barbecue, a softball game, a dance. There's an eating contest. Actually, there were 2 eating contests. And this particular painting, this is, in several pictures, there's this clown who is on the stage and who crowns the winner, who actually crowns Miss Mayfair. And so here the clown has this box, and you can't really see, the clown is kind of dubious. The clown is giving something out, but you don't know what it is. And the people don't look, after learning what I have about textile mills, it kind of strikes me that this reflects what I've learned about textile mills, because it's like people don't particularly, they're not very excited about the prizes. My mother's not even looking at the clown. People aren't that interested. They're waiting for something, but we don't know what they're waiting for. Clown prizes. So some of the things, a couple of things in the picture weren't in the photograph. There were cars up here, but I couldn't see them from the photographs well enough to paint them. So I had a picture of my dad with his car, so I painted him there. So he wasn't really, I cheated a little bit, he wasn't really in the picture. So how I make these, I look at the photographs and draw them on paper, and then cut out the shapes like paper dolls, and then arrange them and trace them and then paint them in, and these are acrylic paint. So they're about my roots, they're about the South, and they're about women and sexism and racism in the South in 1941.
Today's been the first time I've set foot in Hallwalls since we went on a nice trip to North Carolina. To talk about my work, I have a couple of obsessions. One obsession is with prehistoric life, and another obsession I have is about creatures from folk tales and folklore. A long time ago when I first started doing art, I had kind of like formalism kind of force-fed down my throat. And about 7 years ago, I started working on this series as kind of a reaction against that. I use a wide variety of reference material to base my work on. I'm all the time reading books about paleontology, kind of keeping up to date on what's current and what's in vogue. In this particular picture here, I have a picture of two elfin characters standing beside a creature that is known as a Theracid. It's a mammal-like reptile that existed before the age of dinosaurs, and the males were known to have very striking headdresses, I guess maybe to attract mates. And I kind of put them both together because it almost seems like the animal's like your family dog. I really like narrative art, and I like art that you can concoct a story about it. I use mostly acrylic with this current series because I'm kind of limited on time because I'm a Buffalo public school teacher, so I'm working 7 hours a day with a bunch of wild kids there, who I love, don't get me wrong, but they are wild kids. So time is kind of important to me, otherwise I might actually be doing more oil paints than with acrylic. With this technique that I've been working with is I've been mixing a lot of matte medium with my work to kind of get a certain layer effect like the old-time paintings, because I'm really drawn towards 19th century landscape painters like Bierstadt, Asher Durand, Thomas Cole, Frederick Church, and people like that. I guess what can be said about my work is that it's almost kind of, in some ways it might be nostalgic for a time that I never lived through, because a lot of the paintings I work with kind of use 19th century landscapes as a reference, and that time period is kind of like long gone, and you don't see trees the size that you would nowadays that you would see in like a Asher Durand painting, because I don't know, it's funny when you think about that. It's like, trees are harvested, when they get more than like a couple inches in diameter and kind of consumed by our capitalist society. So I guess maybe my work's kind of nostalgic for the past. I guess that's about it.